Maplestory the Novel, Season 1, Sacred Tears. Written by Tatsumari Korisuno. Chapter 9, Part 1. Understanding. The Order of Aurora gained renown in all of Eusoria over the comfortable rush of 5 months. All 6 clerics kept their reach limited to the Victorani province, as they were so few. Other clerics and bishops began begging to be taught their ways for an advantage in combating the creatures made of shadow. The news of having to break their oath of celibacy kept most from accepting, and Dane couldn't blame them. Some of the traveling bishops were aged and well set in their ways. Others just couldn't bring themselves to abandon the orders they had been dedicated to. Clerics and bishops as a whole were few, and despite the need to fight these creatures, clerics and bishops of the deities were needed as well. With direction from Dane and a few weeks of searching, the Order found the Forest of Peace near what most called the Mountain of Healing. Here, the trees grew so thickly the sun was completely blocked out as if it were permanently night. Over the months, enough funds were gathered through offerings and gifts to build a dedicated cottage for them. Despite the forest having been found, they still needed to find a suitable location to build. Why would you pick this place? It's so dark and hard to get to. If anyone wanted our aid, they might be lost, Ferriman noted, using his staff as a torch.
Maybe it's a metaphor, seeking out light within the darkness?
Viren suggested, picking his way through the shrubbery, holding out his hand for his newly married wife, Tasya. They met in the modern city of Kernala when Viren's arm was broken by a particularly violent shadow creature.
No, Viren. It is nothing so intellectual. I heard of and searched for this forest a long time ago. During my search, I met Ephenia and decided to research the darkness more closely instead. In recent weeks, however, my research has stalled. Finding this forest may advance it once more,
Dane explained, tightening his grip on Ephenia's hand while leading them through the trees.
But why here? I feel as if my shoulders are around my chest,
Mars asked with a breath of awe and apprehension.
I had hoped a dark place would ease my study of the darkness,
Dane answered when he held up his staff and dimmed the light emanating from it. Ferriman followed suit as the others maneuvered to one another in the dark, pulling Tasya and Ephenia into the center of the ring.
What's the matter?
Tasya asked with a whisper.
Something is watching us,
Dane whispered, tapping twice on his rod and slowly raising it above his head.
Shield your eyes.
The violet-eyed beings watched the traveling group with disdain. The forest's dark hid most of their violent forms, but even it couldn't hide their glowing violet eyes.
They are the ones. They are the reason. Why did they do it? What did I ever do to them? I was pushed too far because of them.
The chorus of whispers hung thick in the air, each a painful melody of memories from a long past life. Each creature harbored a desire, a deep, insatiable need for justice of their own doing. Some of the beings crept closer to the traveling band, limbs quivering in anticipation. The justice they sought was so close. But something held them all back. It wasn't fear of being defeated. No, that fear had long since left them. It was the fear of being no more, of not attaining the justice they sought. Something among these people, these murderers, was making even the strongest of them shudder. The blue and green-eyed beings were among them, watching from afar. They didn't fear that something as much, but they still felt unrest surrounding the traveling group. And then they stopped.
Crush you. You will wish you never embarrassed me. I will show you the pain you caused. You
multitude of whispers thickened, closing around the traveling group, overpowering their fear of that something. The need for revenge, justice, and resolution drove them on. The blue and green-eyed beings stayed back. They had no vengeful intentions, and playing any kind of trick now wouldn't be as funny, not with the others surrounding them. Instead, they decided to pull away from the depressing air. All at once, the entire area was engulfed in blinding white light. The violet-eyed creatures shrieked in pain as their bodies were shredded to scraps. Flashes and spears of light split the darkened air, tearing through the creatures and trees alike. Hissing masses of whispers arose as the creatures were dispatched. Within a few moments, the area was silent, with only the humans' breathing hanging in the air. The blue and green-eyed beings looked at each other, blinking away the rainbows in their eyes.
What was that?
The green-eyed being asked.
I don't know, but it makes my core feel like it's vibrating.
The blue-eyed being answered.
Let's get out of here.
You have no argument for me?
Is anyone hurt?
Dane asked, slowly lighting the area so as not to blind anyone. Faramond, Mars, and James followed suit, revealing Tasia to have a small gash on her forearm and a burn mark on the side of Xenos' face. Tasia quickly went to him and began applying a disinfectant from a pouch of medicinal supplies on her hip. As she worked, her brow pursed in bewilderment. "What is it?" Xenos asked when he saw her face change.
I'm not sure. Your skin is just turning to dust.
She stammered, reaching into her pouch and pulling out a small, sharp knife. As she did, Tasia cast a glance to her arm, breathing a sigh of relief when only blood was present.
This might sting a bit.
She said, cutting away what appeared to be rotting flesh. But with each passing second, the wound was only becoming worse.
The more I cut, the faster it spreads!
Tasia exclaimed, trying to get ahead of the rapidly growing sore.
Let me try.
Ephenia insisted, holding her hand to the wound, careful to limit herself to the amount of power a human would use. But Xenos' injury was much more stubborn than a superficial burn. It reminded her of the injuries on Dane's arms a few weeks prior. Ephenia carefully applied her divine power to the wound so that it wouldn't be apparent as to who she really was. She first cleared away the rotting flesh, then closed it over quickly, but it would leave a scar for the rest of his life. Dane had explained to the others that she was the last fairy of Eusoria, and to an extent, they all seemed to accept her, which allowed her to use a slight bit of divine power without question. She could use more and leave no scar, but the ruse would be broken. When she asked why Dane wanted to keep her identity a secret, he reminded her that deities walking in Eusoria was unheard of for the average human. If humans found out who she really was, they may have any number of reactions, most of which were not pleasant.
That's very healing magic for you. Always an immense blessing to watch you work, Lady Ephenia.
Mars commented, offering a drink of water to Xenos. Ephenia smiled in thanks, hiding her hands as the divine shine faded from her fingers.
Did you use some?
Dane asked quietly. Ephenia nodded as Dane took her hand and kissed her knuckles, his sleeve covering her clasped hand.
Thank you. Now let's continue on. I think we're close to the ideal spot.
Dane announced, directing the others out of the area. Dane, however, lingered for a time. Something was there in the dark, a pair of presences he had felt ever since he first met Ephenia. They were near and had been so for some time, but the light from his staff and the surrounding shadows prevented his seeing them. Perhaps once they had the cottage built, there would be time to explore and know what these presences were. A combination of strength of arm and knowledge of magic soon had the two-story cottage built. It was smaller than they had hoped, but it was comfortable enough to give Viren and Tasia their own room, as well as Ephenia and Dane for the money available. The others agreed to share a room with the understanding that, if needed, they could expand. Once the building was complete, Faramond and Mars set about making soft lighting crystals around some trees to light their way. Dane then began research in earnest for extracting and eliminating the darkness in the world once and for all. He started small, creating salves, potions, and elixirs to help him extract tiny bits of darkness to contain and study. Perhaps if he could narrow his search to the shades of darkness as he had done before, he would be able to better identify and apply his light. He would discover new shades of darkness with each passing day, but it was far more intense than he could quantify. His research with Minodora revealed in total 7 distinct shades of darkness. His study at the cottage in just under a month showed more than 100, with more appearing daily. Some were similar, but all had their unique signature, making it nigh impossible to know how to apply his light. One day, Ephenia came into his study to see Dane leaning on his hand, furiously scrawling notes on parchment.
If you write any harder, that paper would catch on fire.
She chuckled, standing next to him, putting an arm around his shoulders.
I've managed to find the method for extracting darkness, yet have not been able to find one thing that will help me get rid of it en masse.
Dane sighed with an edge of frustration as he leaned back in his chair and pinched the bridge of his nose. Ephenia looked all around them, noting dozens of small bottles containing what appeared to be black vapors.
Perhaps all these are giving you problems,
She suggested, reaching for one of the bottles to look at it in more detail. But as she picked it up and brought it closer, she began to feel a fear settling into her being. The moments passed slowly as it started to form into a fear of Dane? She pulled her hand away from him as the fear began to split and become something else. Shame. The fear split again. This time, fear that the guilt she felt would be discovered. Questions began to form in her mind.
Why did this happen? I did nothing wrong. Why did he do that? Will I ever be worthy? How could I have been so stupid?
Ephenia's skin turned pale as the world around her faded away into a dark and pressing void. Nothing but her fear, questions, and shame drove themselves into her like spears of fire. As the weight of her feelings began to overwhelm her, the darkness suddenly vanished. Dane pulled the bottle from her hand and gripped her to his chest, holding the bottle away. The stillness slowly calmed her as Dane's heart rhythm gradually brought her back to reality.